They say the desert doesn't decide who lives, it just watches who refuses to die. And on that morning, under a sky bleached white by heat, Ethan Cole saw a line carved into the earth that shouldn't have been there, a long dragging mark stretching nearly half a mile across cracked sand, too straight to be wind, too desperate to be anything but human. His horse slowed before he asked it to, ears twitching, the smell of dust, and something heavier hanging in the air, and Ethan followed that line, with his eyes until it ended in a shape that barely looked like a person anymore. She lay there, motionless except for the shallow rise of breath, dark hair tangled with sand, skin burned by sun that showed no mercy, and where her legs should have carried her away, there was only stillness, wrapped in cloth that told a story he didn't need explained. He didn't move at first, didn't speak, just watched, because out here, stepping into another soul's fate was a decision that stayed with you. Longer than any scar, the wind whispered through dry grass, carrying the faint scent of leather and ash, and her eyes opened, slow, deliberate, finding him without surprise, without fear, just a quiet knowing that settled between them like something already finished. Leave, she said, her voice thin but steady, like a command given not to him, but to the world itself. Ethan felt the weight of that word press against his chest, heavier than any gun he'd ever carried, and for a moment, he listened, because it was easier that way, easier to turn his horse, to let the desert take what it had already claimed, easier to believe that this wasn't his story to step into. He turned, the leather saddle creaking beneath him, took one step, then another, boots pressing into sand that gave way without resistance, and the silence behind him grew louder with every inch of distance, louder than wind, louder than reason, until it wasn't silence anymore. It was something pulling at him, something that didn't ask, didn't beg, just waited. Ethan stopped, the sun pressing down on the back of his neck, and closed his eyes for a second that felt longer than it should have, because he knew what happened next, knew the cost of turning back, knew that once he chose, there would be no clean way out of it. When he opened them again, he was already moving, already walking back toward the line in the sand, toward the woman who had asked him to leave, toward the kind of trouble that didn't come with warning. He knelt beside her, close enough now to see the strength still burning behind her eyes, not fading, not broken, just waiting, and without a word, he reached down, the heat of her skin meeting his hands. And for the first time that day, the desert felt like it was holding its breath. The first thing she did when he lifted her was not thank him, not resist, but reach for the ground she had been lying on, fingers pressing into the hot sand, as if she was leaving something behind or taking something with her. And Ethan noticed the way her hand lingered there for a second longer than it should have before falling still. She was lighter than he expected, not because she was small, but because something in her had already let go of weight the world could not measure. And as he carried her toward his horse, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint trace of smoke and distant movement that made the back of his neck tighten. He did not look toward the horizon yet, because men who lived long out here learned that some things were better confirmed later, when there was time to act. He settled her carefully across the saddle, securing her with a steadiness that came from years of handling, things that could break without warning. And when he mounted behind her, he felt the heat of her body through the fabric, felt the slow rhythm of breath that refused to stop even when everything else had. The ride back to his cabin stretched longer than usual, every mile marked by silence. No questions asked, no answers offered, just the steady creak of leather and the dull thud of hooves against dry earth. She did not speak again, but once, when the horse stumbled over uneven ground, her hand moved, gripping his sleeve with a strength that surprised him, not desperate, not fearful, just certain, as if she expected him to remain exactly where he was. Ethan did not pull away. His cabin stood alone against the open land, a weathered structure that had outlasted more seasons than most men cared to count, its wooden walls carrying the scent of smoke, oil, and quiet endurance. And when he pushed the door open with his shoulder, the hinges gave a low groan that echoed through the single room like a warning or a welcome, depending on who was listening. He laid her down on the narrow bed near the window where the light was softer, where the sun did not strike directly, and for a moment, he stood there, looking at her as if waiting for something, a word, a sign. anything that would make this choice feel less final than it already was. But she only turned her head slightly, eyes half open, watching him with that same steady gaze that did not ask for help and did not refuse it either. Ethan moved then, slow, deliberate, gathering water, cloth, the few supplies he kept for injuries that usually belonged to cattle or himself, not strangers pulled from the edge of death. And as he worked, he noticed something resting against her chest, half hidden beneath worn fabric, a small piece of leather bound with thread, marked with symbols he did not fully understand but recognized as something that mattered. It had been removed once, the cord frayed where it had been pulled, and now it lay there like something waiting to be returned. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the cabin walls, carrying a low sound from far across the land, not loud enough to name, but enough to remind him that nothing out here stayed unnoticed for long. Inside, the room filled with the quiet rhythm of breath and movement. And for the first time since he had turned back in the desert, Ethan understood that this was no longer about saving a life. It was about standing between what had already been decided and what might still change. The night settled in slow, stretching shadows across the cabin floor as the heat of the day faded into a dry, restless wind, and Ethan sat in the chair by the wall, not sleeping, not moving much either, just listening to the small sounds that told him she was still holding on. Her breathing had changed, steadier now, not as shallow as before, but still quiet, like someone who had learned long ago that making noise did not bring help. And when she shifted on the bed, even slightly, his eyes opened without delay, drawn back to her the way a man listens for trouble before he sees it. The fire in the corner gave off a low glow, enough to soften the edges of the room, enough to reveal the lines of her face that had not relaxed even in rest. And he noticed the way her hand rested near that small leather piece against her chest, fingers brushing it. Now and then, as if confirming it was still there. Sometime past midnight, she opened her eyes fully, not startled, not confused, just aware, and for a long moment she did not look at him, but at the ceiling, as if measuring the distance between where she had been and where she was now. Then she turned her head slightly, her gaze finding him in the dim light, steady, unflinching. "You should have left," she said, her voice stronger than before, though still quiet, and Ethan did not answer right away, because out here, words were not given lightly, and explanations meant less than choices already made. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and after a moment, he spoke, his voice low. "Even, you were not done yet." And something in her expression shifted, not softer, not warmer, but sharper, like a blade being tested for the first time. She studied him as if weighing the truth of that, as if deciding whether he believed it or simply needed to. "My people decided otherwise," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no anger, just a statement that carried more weight than most men could stand. The wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, slipping through the gaps in the wood, carrying with it that same distant sound Ethan had noticed before, closer now, though still far enough to pretend it was nothing. He stood slowly, moving to the door, opening it just enough to look out into the dark, where the land stretched wide and silent, the horizon barely visible under a sky scattered with cold stars. And there, far off, he saw it. Not shapes, not figures, just the faint rise of dust that did not belong to the wind. He closed the door without a word, the latch settling into place with a quiet finality. And when he turned back, she was watching him, not asking what he had seen, because she already knew. "They will come," she said, not as a warning, but as certainty, and Ethan nodded once, not denying it, not questioning it, just accepting the weight of what was already moving toward them. He stepped closer to the bed, reaching down to adjust the thin blanket over her, his hand brushing briefly against the leather cord at her chest, and for a second, he hesitated, then lifted it slightly, examining the worn edges, the symbols carved into it, and without asking, without explaining, he placed it back where it belonged, settling it against her skin as if returning something that had never truly been lost. Outside, the wind carried on, steady and patient, and inside the cabin, the silence deepened, not empty, but waiting, as if the land itself was preparing to witness what would happen when those who had walked away finally chose to return. Morning came without softness. the light cutting through the thin curtains like something sharp and honest, revealing every corner of the cabin exactly as it was. Nothing hidden, nothing forgiven, and Ethan was already awake, standing by the window with a tin cup in his hand that had long gone cold. Outside, the land stretched quiet, but it was not the same quiet as before, not empty, not still, but waiting. The kind of waiting that settled into a man's bones and made him listen harder than he wanted to. Behind him, the faint shift of movement pulled his attention back, and she was awake again, more present this time, her eyes clearer, her breathing stronger, though her body had not changed its reality. And yet there was nothing fragile about the way she held herself against it. She pushed herself slightly upward, not asking for help, not expecting it, and Ethan stepped forward anyway, steadying the edge of the bed with one hand, not touching her unless needed, because he understood enough to know that strength sometimes meant leaving space. "You hear them," she said, not a question, and he nodded once, setting the cup aside, his gaze moving briefly toward the door before returning to her. "They are closer," she continued, her voice calm, almost reflective, as if she was describing weather rather than something that had once been her people. Ethan pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat, elbows resting on his knees, his posture relaxed but ready, the way a man sits when he knows standing too soon might make things worse. "You can leave," she said after a moment, repeating the same word she had given him in the desert, but it did not carry the same meaning now, not command, not dismissal, but something closer to permission. Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a sound of thought rather than response, and shook his head slightly, not dramatic, not defiant, just certain. "Not today," he said, and that was all. Her eyes stayed on him longer this time, searching not for weakness, not for fear, but for something harder to find, something that could not be spoken. And whatever she saw there made her lean back again, not surrendering, but settling into a truth she had not expected to meet. The wind pressed against the walls again, stronger now, carrying with it a rhythm that was no longer distant, a pattern that belonged to riders who knew the land well enough to move without being seen until they chose to be. Ethan stood, moving across the room with quiet efficiency, checking what little he had: water, cloth, the small things that mattered more than anything else when the world narrowed down to a single place and a single moment. He paused near the door, his hand resting on the wood, feeling the faint vibration carried through it, not imagined, not guessed, but real. And behind him, she spoke again, softer this time, but no less steady. "They did not leave me because I was weak," she said, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond him, beyond the walls. "They left me because I could no longer fight the way they understand." And Ethan turned slightly, listening, not interrupting, because some truths were not meant to be questioned. "Out there," she continued, her fingers brushing the leather cord at her chest, "standing means more than breathing." And for a moment, the room held that thought between them, heavy, undeniable. Ethan nodded once, not because he fully understood, but because he respected the weight of it. And when he opened the door, the wind rushed in, carrying dust and distance and the unmistakable presence of those who had finally arrived. And he stepped out onto the porch, not with urgency, not with fear, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who had already made his choice long before the riders reached his land. The porch boards creaked under Ethan's weight as he stepped out into the open, the morning light stretching long across the land, turning dust into something almost golden. And there they were, just beyond the rise, not rushing, not hiding, but moving with a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself. A line of riders, spaced wide, their horses steady, their presence heavier than sound, and Ethan stood still, one hand resting loosely at his side, not reaching for anything, because out here, the first move was not always the strongest, and sometimes it was the last. The wind shifted again, brushing past him, carrying the scent of leather, smoke, and distance traveled with purpose, and the riders slowed as they approached the edge of his land, not crossing it yet, not breaking that invisible line that men who understood territory rarely ignored. Inside the cabin, the air held stillness, but it was not empty. It listened, it waited, and on the bed, she had not closed her eyes, had not turned away from the door, her gaze fixed forward as if she could see through the wood, through the distance, through the years that had led them all to this moment. Ethan took one step forward off the porch, boots pressing into the dry earth, and that was enough. The riders came to a full stop, their formation holding, no one speaking, no one reaching, just watching, measuring, the way people do when the past stands in front of them in a form they did not expect. One of them shifted slightly ahead of the others, not by much, but enough to mark him as something more than the rest, his posture upright, his presence quiet but undeniable, and even from this distance, Ethan could feel the weight of his attention, steady, unblinking, like a question that did not need to be asked out loud. The silence. Stretched, not uncomfortable, not tense in the way men in towns would call tension, but full, carrying meaning in every breath of wind, in every small movement of horse and rider. Ethan did not speak, because he understood that words would not change what had already been decided long before any of them arrived here. And behind him, through the open door, there was the faint sound of movement, not hurried, not uncertain, but deliberate, and he did not turn to look, because he knew what it meant. Inside, she had pushed herself upright again, hands gripping the edge of the bed, her body resisting what had been taken from it, not with anger, not with desperation, but with something quieter, something stronger, and when her feet did not answer, she did not wait for them. She shifted forward, inch by inch, until the floor met her hands, until the distance between her and that door was no longer measured in steps, but in will. Outside, the riders remained still, but something had changed, not in their position, not in their formation, but in the way they watched, as if they too had felt that shift inside the cabin, as if they understood that this moment was no longer about what had been done, but about what would be shown. Ethan stood there, between them and the door, not blocking, not threatening, just present, and the wind moved again, lifting dust into the air between them, soft, almost gentle, as if even the land itself was holding back, waiting to see whether what came next would be decided by force, or by something far more difficult. To stand against the silence did not break. It deepened, stretching between the riders and the man standing alone in front of his cabin, until even the wind seemed to slow, as if it understood that something unseen was about to take shape. And then the door behind Ethan moved, not wide, not sudden, just enough to be noticed. He did not turn, not immediately, because some moments did not need eyes to be understood. They carried their own weight, their own presence, and the faint sound that followed was not footsteps, not the rhythm of someone walking, but something slower, measured, each movement deliberate, each inch earned. The riders saw it before he did, their attention shifting past him, not with alarm, not with aggression, but with a quiet recognition that settled over them like a shadow moving across open ground. Ethan turned then, just enough to see her, just enough to understand what she had chosen, and there she was, at the doorway, her hands against the wooden frame, her body held upright not by strength of limb, but by something far less visible and far more difficult to break. The light caught her from behind, outlining her form against the darkness of the cabin, and for a moment, she did not move forward. She simply stood there, meeting the distance between herself and the riders with nothing but her gaze. The leather cord at her chest rested where he had placed it, the small piece of meaning returning to its place without ceremony, without words, and her fingers brushed it once, not for reassurance, but as if acknowledging that it had never truly left her. Ethan stepped slightly aside then, not retreating, not yielding, but making space, because he understood now that this was no longer his line to hold, and the ground between them belonged to something older than him, older than the cabin, older than the boundaries men tried to draw across it. She moved then, slow, steady, her hands guiding her forward across the wooden boards of the porch, each motion controlled, each breath measured, and there was no hesitation in it, no sign of the struggle it must have taken to reach that point, only purpose. The riders did not advance, did not speak, but something in their stillness changed, a subtle shift in posture, in the way their shoulders settled, in the way their attention fixed fully on her, no longer divided, no longer uncertain. The man at the front remained where he was, his presence unchanged, but his gaze had altered, no longer measuring, no longer questioning, but recognizing. and that recognition carried across the space between them more clearly than any word could have. She reached the edge of the porch and stopped, not because she could not go further, but because she did not need to. And there, under the open sky, with the land stretched wide and silent around them, she lifted her head slightly, meeting them fully, not as someone left behind, not as someone waiting to be judged, but as someone who had already decided who she was without their permission. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying dust that drifted between them like a veil, and Ethan stood to the side, watching, understanding in a way he had not before that strength was not always something that stood tall. Sometimes it was something that refused to lower itself even when the world expected it to. And out there, beyond the edge of his land, the riders did not move forward. They did not turn away. They simply remained, held in place by a truth that no longer needed to be spoken aloud. No one spoke. And yet something had already been said, something older than language, something that settled into the space between them and refused to move. And the man at the front of the riders shifted his weight slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to show that he had heard what had not been spoken. His eyes remained on her, steady, unblinking, and for a long moment, he did nothing else, as if he was measuring not her strength, but the absence of everything she had lost and the presence of everything she had refused to give away. The others behind him remained still, but their stillness was no longer the same. It was no longer the waiting of those who had come to decide something. It had become the stillness of those who had already seen enough. The wind moved across the land again, softer now, carrying dust that settled slowly, as if even it did not want to disturb what was unfolding. And on the porch, she did not lower her gaze, did not shift, did not show the strain that must have been there beneath the surface, because what mattered now was not what she could endure, but what she would allow to be taken from her. Ethan watched from the side, his presence quiet, his hands empty, understanding that anything he did now would only lessen what was already happening. And so he stayed where he was, not part of it, but not apart from it either. The man at the front finally moved then, a small motion, but one that carried more weight than any step forward could have, his hand lifting slowly, not toward a weapon, not toward command, but toward something at his own chest, where a similar cord rested, worn, marked by time. And he touched it briefly, not as a signal to the others, but as an acknowledgement of something shared, something that could not be taken away by distance or by loss. Her eyes followed that movement, not with surprise, not with relief, but with recognition. The kind that does not ask for explanation because it already understands. And, for the first time since she had stepped into the light, something in her expression shifted, not softer, not weaker, but complete, as if a piece that had been left unfinished had quietly found its place again. The man lowered his hand and held her gaze for one more moment, long enough for the meaning to settle, long enough for it to be carried by more than just the two of them. And then, without a word, without a command, he turned his horse slightly, not away from her, but away from the line they had been holding, and that was all it took. The others followed, not in haste, not in retreat, but in understanding, their horses turning one by one, the line breaking without breaking, dissolving into movement that carried no shame, no defeat, only acceptance. The dust rose gently beneath them as they moved, not covering their tracks, not hiding their presence, just marking that they had been there and had chosen something different than what they had come for. On the porch, she remained, where she was, watching until the last of them disappeared beyond the rise, her gaze steady until there was nothing left to see but open land, and only then did her shoulders lower slightly, not in surrender, but in release. Ethan stepped forward then, not quickly, not urgently, just enough to be near, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said, nothing that words could carry better than the silence that had just passed between them. The dust settled slowly after the riders disappeared, drifting back to the earth as if nothing had happened, as if the land had already begun to forget. But the silence that followed was different now, not heavy, not waiting, but complete in a way that left no room for doubt. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last shape had faded. Then he turned back toward her, and she had not moved from where she held herself at the edge of the porch. her hands still steady against the wood, her shoulders still lifted, but the tension that had carried her there had begun to ease, not fading, not weakening, but settling into something quieter. The wind brushed past them. Again, softer this time, carrying no warning, no distant movement, only the dry scent of open land stretching for miles in every direction. And Ethan stepped closer, not to take over, not to interrupt, but simply to be there, within reach if needed. She lowered herself slowly, controlled, her hands guiding her back down to the boards beneath her, not collapsing, not giving in, but choosing the ground on her own terms. And for a moment, she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement of something that had just passed through her life and left it changed. Ethan crouched beside her, his movements careful, unhurried, and he did not touch her at first, because he had learned that some moments asked for presence, not action. "They saw you," he said quietly, his voice steady, and she opened her eyes again, turning her head slightly toward him, the faintest hint of something different in her expression, not relief, not gratitude, but something closer to peace. "They remembered," she answered, her voice low, carrying a weight that did not need explanation, and Ethan nodded once, understanding enough to leave the rest unspoken. The cabin behind them stood open, the doorway framing the dim interior where shadows still lingered, and the world outside felt wider now, not because it had changed, but because something within it had shifted its place. Ethan reached out then, offering his hand, not pulling, not insisting, just there, and she looked at it for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring not the gesture, but what it meant, and then she took it, her grip firm, not fragile, not hesitant, and allowed him to help her back inside. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath them as he guided her to the bed again, settling her where the light fell softer, where the heat of the day had not yet reached, and when he stepped back, she adjusted herself without asking, without needing assistance, her movements slower now, but no less certain. Her fingers found the leather cord at her chest again, tracing its edge with quiet familiarity, and for the first time, she held it there, not as something lost and returned, but as something that had remained through everything, unchanged. Outside, the land stretched silent once more, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt witnessed, as if the earth itself had taken note of what had happened and would carry it long after the dust had settled completely. Ethan moved to the doorway again, leaning lightly against the frame, his gaze drifting outward, not searching for what had left, but watching what remained, and behind him. In the stillness of the cabin, she rested, not as someone abandoned, not as someone waiting, but as someone who had stood without standing and had not been turned away, and the space between them held that truth quietly. Without the need for anything more, the afternoon stretched long and quiet, the kind of quiet that settles only after something important has already passed, and Ethan remained by the doorway, his shoulder resting lightly against the frame, watching the land not for what might come, but for what had already chosen to leave, and there was a difference in that kind of watching, a weight lifted that did not need to be named. Behind him, the soft shift of movement told him she was awake again, not restless, not struggling, but present, and when he turned, she was sitting slightly higher against the wall, the light catching her face in a way that no longer carried the same edge it had before, not because anything had been restored, but because something had been reclaimed. Her hand rested over the leather cord at her chest, not gripping it, not searching for it, just there, as if it had finally settled into place the way it was meant to. Ethan stepped back inside, the wooden floor answering quietly beneath his boots, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two people who had stood at the edge of something and had not stepped away. "They will not return," he said, not as a guess, not as hope, but as something he understood in the way the land felt now, in the way the air no longer carried that distant tension, and she nodded once, slow, deliberate, her eyes steady. "They do not need to," she replied, and there was no bitterness in her voice, no trace of what had been done, only a calm certainty that did not ask for more. Ethan pulled the chair closer again, sitting across from her, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely, and for the first time since he had found her in the desert, the space between them felt open, not guarded, not weighed down by unspoken things. Outside, the wind moved gently across the open ground, carrying with it the faint sound of dry grass brushing together, a sound that belonged to a world continuing as it always had, unchanged and yet somehow different. She shifted slightly, adjusting her position with care, and he noticed the way she moved now, not testing what she had lost, but working with what remained, each motion deliberate, each pause intentional, and there was strength in that, a kind of strength that did not need to prove itself. "You stayed," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, not questioning, not challenging, just stating what had been done. And Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze steady. "So did you," he answered, and that was enough. The light in the room softened as the sun moved lower, stretching shadows along the walls, and neither of them rushed to fill the silence that followed, because it no longer needed to be filled. Time passed in small, quiet ways, the shifting of light, the cooling of air, the settling of dust, and in that time, something steady took root, not spoken, not promised, but there, as real as the ground beneath the cabin. As the day began to fade, Ethan stood again, stepping out onto the porch, looking out over the land that had witnessed everything without taking sides, and for a moment, he let his eyes rest on the horizon where the riders had once stood, now empty, now just part of the distance. Inside, she remained where she was, her hand still resting over the cord, her posture calm, her gaze no longer fixed on what had been lost, but on what still was. And out there, under a sky beginning to dim, the land held its silence, not as something empty, but as something full, carrying the quiet truth that out here, a person did not need to stand on their feet to stand their ground, and sometimes, the strongest thing a person could do was simply refuse to disappear. "Take my children, just leave me," the woman said, her voice steady in a way that didn't belong to fear. And that was the moment Ethan Cole knew something in this desert had already gone wrong long before he arrived. The wind dragging fine dust across his boots, the sun hanging low enough to turn everything gold and unforgiving. Two small figures pressed against her sides, silent, watching him like he was the last door left in a burning house. And behind them, far out past the dry ridge, a thin line of movement began to form. Riders, maybe a dozen, their shapes bending with the heat, closing the distance mile by mile. And Ethan didn't need a scope to understand what that meant out here. He had seen that kind of line before, the kind that didn't stop to ask questions, the kind that followed tracks until there was nothing left to follow. His hand rested near his holster, not gripping, not ready, just there, like a habit he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. The woman stepped forward. Then, slower than the wind, her eyes dark, not pleading, not angry, just decided, and she placed something small into his palm, a thin necklace made of bone and worn cord, light as nothing but heavy in a way he couldn't explain. "If they live," she said quietly, "they belong to no one." And for a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind softened, even the dust hesitated. Ethan looked down at the two children, the boy trying to stand taller than he was, the girl clutching a fold of her mother's dress, neither crying, neither speaking, just waiting. And that waiting cut deeper than any shout ever could. He had been taught a long time ago what Apache meant, what danger looked like, what side a man was supposed to stand on, but nothing in those lessons had prepared him for this, for a mother offering her children like she was already halfway gone, for eyes that carried more resolve than fear, for silence that felt louder than gunfire. The riders were closer now. Close enough that the rhythm of hooves began to carry through the ground, steady, certain, inevitable. Ethan's jaw tightened, not from anger, not from fear, but from something harder to name, something that didn't fit in the world he thought he understood. The girl reached out then, small fingers brushing against his coat, not pulling, not begging, just touching like she needed to know he was real. And in that single contact, something inside him shifted, quiet but permanent, like a door opening somewhere he didn't know existed. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he knows there's no stepping back, and he closed his hand around the necklace, feeling the worn edges press into his skin. The riders were coming. The desert offered no cover, no mercy, no time, only choice. And Ethan Cole realized, standing there between a mother who had already chosen sacrifice and children who hadn't yet learned what losing meant, that whatever he said next wasn't just words. It was a line drawn in dust that the wind wouldn't be able to erase. The riders did not rush, and that was what made them dangerous. Their pace steady, measured, like men who already knew how this would end. The sound of hooves rolling low across the ground like distant thunder. Ethan could feel it through the soles of his boots. A quiet reminder that time was no longer something he had. The woman stepped back after placing the necklace in his hand, not retreating, just creating space. As if she had already removed herself from whatever came next, her eyes moved. To the horizon once, then back to the children, memorizing them in a way that needed no words. The boy shifted closer to Ethan now, unsure but willing, while the girl still held on to her mother's dress. Her grip small but unbreakable. Ethan looked between them, then out toward the riders again. Shapes clearer now, hats low, shoulders squared. Not lawmen, not soldiers. Just men who moved with purpose and silence. The kind of men who did not ask permission from the land or the people on it. He turned slightly, scanning the terrain behind him, a narrow stretch of dry wash leading toward broken rock and a canyon that most would miss if they did not know where to look. He knew it, not because it was marked on any map, but because of stories, quiet ones, passed down in pieces he had not understood until now. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of leather and dust, closer than before. The woman spoke again, softer this time. You do not understand what they will do. And Ethan nodded once, not because he agreed, but because he understood enough to know that standing still was not an option. The girl finally let go of the dress, her hand slipping free as if something inside her had already accepted what her mother had decided. She stepped toward Ethan without looking back, and that was the moment the air changed. The kind of moment that does not make a sound but still feels like something has been set in motion. Ethan crouched slightly, bringing himself level with the children, his voice low, steady. Stay close, do not fall behind. The boy nodded quickly. The girl said nothing, but her eyes stayed on him, searching for something she had not yet found. Ethan rose again, turning to the woman. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to carry weight. Long enough to hold every unspoken thing between them. Then he reached out, not pulling, not forcing, just offering his hand. A simple gesture that did not belong in a world like this. The riders were close enough now that the dust they carried began to blur the horizon, their presence pressing in without a single word spoken. The woman hesitated, just for a breath, her eyes flickering to the children, then back to Ethan, and in that hesitation lived everything. Fear, trust, doubt, and something else that had no name. Ethan did not move his hand, did not speak again. He simply waited, and waiting out here was not weakness. It was a choice, the kind that told the truth without needing to say it. The ground trembled slightly as the riders drew nearer, the canyon behind them silent, hidden, the only path left that did not lead straight into the open, and Ethan Cole stood there, between what was coming and what could still be saved, holding out his hand as if the entire world had narrowed down to that one decision. The woman looked at his hand as if it did not belong to this world, as if no one had ever offered it without a price. The wind tugging lightly at her hair, carrying the sound of hooves now close enough to count the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, steady and unbroken. Her fingers twitched once at her side, not reaching, not yet, and Ethan did not move, did not rush her, because he knew something most men out here never learned. That trust was not taken, it was given, and only once. The boy shifted again, stepping half a pace closer to Ethan, his small boots pressing into the dust like he had already made his choice, while the girl remained still, her eyes moving between her mother and the outstretched hand, trying to understand a moment too large for her years. The riders were clearer now, shapes turning into men, coats, hats, the glint of metal catching sunlight in brief flashes, not chaotic, not wild, just certain, and certainty like that left no room for mercy. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the necklace in his other hand, the worn bone edges pressing deeper into his palm, grounding him, reminding him that this was not just about escape. This was about what kind of man he would be when the dust settled. The woman finally lifted her gaze fully to his, searching, measuring, as if trying to read something beyond his face, beyond his stance, into whatever lay underneath. And for a brief second, something softened there. Not trust, not yet, but the absence of refusal. Her hand rose slowly, hesitant, the movement small but heavy with everything she had left, and when her fingers touched his, the contact was light, almost uncertain, but real. Ethan closed his hand around hers, not tight, not claiming, just enough to say she would not be left behind. And that was when the air shifted again, not from the wind, not from the riders, but from something deeper, something unseen that had finally been decided. "We move now," he said quietly, his voice steady, carrying no urgency even though time had run thin. He turned toward the narrow wash, guiding the children first, the boy keeping pace, the girl glancing back once, just once, at her mother before following. The woman moved with them now, not ahead, not behind, but beside, her steps measured, silent, as if she had walked this land long before he ever had. The ground dipped slightly as they entered the dry channel, the walls rising just enough to break the line of sight from the open plain. The sound of hooves dulled behind them but did not fade. The riders were still coming, still following. Ethan did not look back, not because he did not care, but because looking back would change nothing. The path ahead narrowed, bending toward rock and shadow, a place most would pass without noticing. But he did not miss it. He could not afford to. The girl stumbled once on a loose stone, and his hand steadied her before she could fall. Quick, instinctive, and she looked up at him then, really looked, as if trying to understand why he had not done what was expected, why he had not walked away when he had the chance. Ethan did not answer, because there was no answer that would fit into words, only choices, and he had already made his. The canyon mouth waited ahead, quiet, hidden, a line between what was and what could still be, and as they crossed into its shadow, the last light of the open desert slipping behind them, Cole understood that whatever came next would not be about survival alone. It would be about something far heavier, something carried not in his hands, but in the space between the people walking beside him. The canyon swallowed the last of the sunlight as they stepped deeper inside, the air cooling just enough to make the silence feel heavier. Sound did not travel the same way here. It folded into the stone, softened, stretched thin until even their footsteps seemed like they belonged to someone else. Ethan slowed his pace without saying a word, his eyes moving across the rock walls, the narrow ledges, the places where shadow held longer than it should. This was not a place for speed. This was a place for knowing where to step and when to stop. The boy stayed close at his side, matching him step for step, while the girl walked just behind, her small hand brushing against the canyon wall, as if it could steady something inside her. The woman moved differently now, not hesitant, not uncertain, but aware, her gaze shifting ahead, then back, reading the space in a way Ethan could not fully follow. And for the first time since they had met, he realized this was not her first time walking into danger, only her first time choosing not to face it alone. The sound of hooves reached them again, muted but present, echoing faintly off the stone behind them, closer than before, not rushing, still certain, and that certainty pressed forward like a shadow that could not be outrun. Ethan raised his hand slightly, signaling them to slow, then stop. He crouched near the ground, studying the dust where their tracks had already begun to settle. The canyon would hide them, but not for long, not if. The men behind knew how to read the land, and men like that always did. The girl looked at him, her voice barely above a breath. "Are they coming here?" And he did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because some truths did not need to be spoken to be understood. Instead, he stood again, turning toward a narrow break in the rock ahead, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. A path no wider than a man's shoulders, bending into deeper shadow. He had seen it once. Years ago, when he was younger, before he understood why some places were left off maps, before he knew that certain paths were not meant to be found by everyone. He gestured toward it, this way, his voice calm, steady, the kind of voice that did not argue with fear, only moved through it. The boy hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing back toward the sound behind them, then forward again, choosing without needing to be told. The girl followed, her steps quicker now, not from panic, but from trust she did not yet realize she had given. The woman paused at the entrance, her hand brushing lightly against the rock, her eyes narrowing as if recognizing something old, something familiar. And then she stepped through, and for a moment, as she passed, her shoulder brushed Ethan's arm, a quiet contact that carried more than words ever could. Inside, the light dimmed further, the walls closing in just enough to make the world feel smaller, more focused, each breath more deliberate. Ethan moved ahead, leading them through the bend, the necklace still in his hand, its weight no longer unfamiliar, but something he had begun to carry without thinking. The sound of hooves faded slightly, then returned again, shifting direction, searching, not lost, just adjusting. And Ethan knew then that this was not a matter of distance, not a matter of speed, but of time, how much they had, how much they could make, how long before the line behind them caught up to the path ahead. And as the canyon tightened around them, the sky above reduced to a thin strip of fading light. Ethan Cole understood that the land was no longer just something beneath his feet. It had become part of the choice he made, and it would either carry them forward or reveal them completely. The path narrowed until their shoulders almost brushed the stone, the air cooler now, carrying a faint scent of earth that had not seen sunlight in years. Ethan slowed again, not because he was unsure, but because the canyon demanded it. Every step placed with care, every movement measured. The boy followed closely, breathing steady but quicker now, while the girl stayed just behind, her hand no longer touching the wall, now holding onto the back of Ethan's coat, not tightly, just enough to stay anchored. The woman walked beside them in silence, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, reading the space ahead with a quiet intensity. And then she spoke, not loudly, not to interrupt, but to be heard. "You know this place." And Ethan did not look at her when he answered. "I know enough." His voice low, carrying no pride, only truth. The canyon bent sharply to the left, then opened slightly into a narrow chamber where the ground dipped and the walls rose higher, creating a pocket of stillness that felt separate from the world behind them. Ethan raised his hand again, signaling them to stop. He listened, not just for the riders, but for the absence of sound, for the way the canyon held or released what passed through it. The hooves were still there, faint but steady, but something had changed. The rhythm had shifted, spreading out, searching, no longer certain of direction, and that was the first crack in their advantage. Small, but enough. The girl looked up at him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Are we safe here?" And Ethan paused, not answering right away, because safety was not something this land offered freely. But he crouched slightly, meeting her eyes. "For a moment," he said, and the words settled between them. Not a promise, but something close enough to hold on to. The boy glanced toward the entrance they had come through, then back at Ethan, his voice quiet but firm. "They will find us." And there was no fear in it, only understanding, the kind that came too early in a child's life. Ethan nodded once. "Maybe," he said. And then he looked at the woman, really looked this time, not as someone he had chosen to help, but as someone who understood the land in a way he did not. "Is there another way?" he asked, and for the first time, she did not hesitate, her gaze shifting toward a narrow ledge along the right wall, barely visible, rising at a steep angle before disappearing into shadow. "There is always another way," she said quietly, "but not for everyone." The words hung there, heavy with meaning, and Ethan followed her gaze, studying the ledge, calculating distance, footing, time. The girl tightened her hold on his coat slightly, sensing the shift without needing explanation. The boy stepped closer, ready without being told, and Ethan felt the weight of the necklace again in his hand, the small bones pressing against his skin, a reminder of the choice already made. He stood slowly, exhaling once, steady, controlled, then looked back toward the entrance of the chamber, where the light from the outside had begun to fade, replaced by the long shadows of approaching dusk. And somewhere beyond that light, the riders were still moving, still searching, still certain that the land would eventually give them what they wanted. Ethan turned back to the ledge, then to the three figures beside him, and in that moment, the path forward was no longer just about escape. It was about who would make it across, who would not, and whether the choice he had made back in the open desert was one he could carry all the way through. The ledge did not look like a path meant for living things. It clung to the canyon wall like a forgotten thought, narrow, uneven, rising at an angle that asked more from a man than most were willing to give. Ethan studied it in silence, his eyes tracing each inch, measuring distance, weight, the way shadows gathered along its edge. He knew what it meant when the land offered a way like this. It was not a gift, it was a test. The woman stepped closer to the base of the rock, her hand brushing against the stone as if greeting something familiar. "It will hold," she said, her voice certain, but not comforting. Certainty out here did not promise safety, only possibility. Ethan glanced at the children, the boy already watching the ledge with quiet resolve, while the girl's grip tightened slightly on his coat, not pulling back, not refusing, just aware, and that awareness was heavier than fear. The sound of hooves shifted again, closer now, echoing faintly through the canyon entrance, no longer searching wide, but narrowing, finding direction. Time had thinned to something fragile, something that could break if held too long. Ethan exhaled slowly, then moved, stepping toward the base of the ledge, testing the first foothold with the weight of his boot. The rock held, solid, unmoving. He turned back, his voice low but firm. "I go first." Not a command, not a question, just the order of things. The boy nodded immediately, while the girl looked up at him, her eyes searching again, not for answers, but for steadiness, and he gave it to her with nothing more than a look. Calm, grounded, enough. He began the climb, one hand finding the edge, the other balancing against the wall, each step deliberate, no wasted movement. The canyon fell quiet around him. Even the distant hooves seemed to pause, as if watching, as if waiting to see which way this would turn. He reached a narrow bend in the ledge, enough space to turn slightly, to look back. "Now," he said softly, and the boy moved first, quicker than expected, his small hands finding the rock with a natural instinct that surprised Ethan, climbing not with fear, but with focus. The girl followed, slower, careful, her steps smaller but steady, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, not daring to look down. The woman came last, her movements fluid, controlled, as if the ledge was not an obstacle, but something she had known all her life. Halfway up, the wind shifted again, carrying the sound of voices now, distant but present, not shouting, not calling, just speaking in tones that did not belong to Mercy. Ethan felt the pressure of time tighten around them, the kind that did not rush but still moved forward. He extended his hand again as the girl reached the bend, steadying her without a word, her fingers gripping his wrist for just a second before letting go. Trust given and released in the same breath. The boy reached the higher edge first, pulling himself onto a narrow shelf above, turning back immediately, ready to help, ready to be part of something larger than himself. And when the woman reached the bend, her eyes met Ethan's again, just for a moment. And in that moment there was no fear, no doubt, only recognition, as if she understood now what kind of man stood beside her, not from what he said, but from what he had refused to do. They moved the final stretch together, the ledge widening just enough to allow them to stand, the canyon below stretching out in shadow, the entrance now partially hidden by rock and fading light. The sound of hooves still there, still coming, but no longer certain, no longer in control. And as Ethan stepped onto the higher ground, the necklace still held tight in his hand, he realized that this path had not just lifted them away from danger, it had changed the balance between what was hunting them and what could no longer be reached. But the canyon was not finished yet, and neither was the choice he had made. The higher ground did not feel like safety. It felt like distance, the kind that let a man see more clearly what followed behind him. Ethan stepped closer to the edge, not too far, just enough to look down into the canyon below. The light had thinned into a narrow band of gold along the upper rim, while the lower walls had already fallen into shadow. And there, moving through that shadow, the riders appeared again, smaller now, their shapes broken by rock and distance, but still together, still, steady. They had found the canyon, and that alone told him everything he needed to know. These were not men who turned back easily. The boy came to stand beside him, his breathing quiet but controlled, his eyes fixed downward, not afraid, just watching, learning. The girl stayed close behind, her hand now resting lightly against the woman's arm, as if the two of them had found something in each other that did not need words. The woman stepped forward slowly, her gaze following Ethan's, then shifting upward along the canyon walls, tracing lines only she seemed to understand. "They will not stop," she said, her voice calm. Not warning, not worried, simply stating what was already true. Ethan nodded once, his fingers tightening slightly around the necklace. The worn bone edges familiar now. Grounding, he turned away from the edge, scanning the path ahead. The ledge they stood on continued along the wall, narrowing again before bending out of sight. No clear end, no clear promise, just more of the same, step by step, choice by choice. The wind moved through the upper canyon now, softer, carrying less dust, but bringing with it a different sound, a faint echo of voices. Rising from below, not loud, not frantic, but closer than before, adjusting, narrowing their search. Ethan looked at the children, then at the woman, and something shifted again, not in the land, not in the danger, but in him. The weight he carried was no longer just about keeping them ahead. It was about what came after, where they would go when the canyon ended, what kind of place would take them in, what kind of man would stand between them and the world waiting beyond these walls. The boy spoke then, his voice low but steady. "We keep moving." And Ethan looked at him, really looked, seeing not just a child, but someone already learning the shape of survival. He gave a small nod. "We keep moving," he repeated, and the words settled between them like something solid, something shared. The girl glanced back once toward the canyon below, then turned forward again without speaking, her silence no longer uncertain, but decided. The woman moved beside Ethan as they began to walk again. Along the narrow ledge, her steps sure, her presence no longer distant, but aligned, and after a few moments, she spoke again, quieter this time. "You chose wrong. For your world." Ethan did not look at her. When he answered, his eyes on the path ahead, "Maybe," he said, then after a breath, "or maybe I chose right for this one." And the words hung there, not needing agreement, not needing proof, just existing in the space between them. The ledge curved ahead, the canyon opening slightly in the distance where the light still held, and somewhere beyond that, the land would change again, into something wider, something open, something that would ask a different kind of question. But behind them, the sound of hooves still echoed, still followed, still refused to fade. And Ethan Cole understood that distance alone would not end this, that the line he had drawn back in the desert was still being followed, step by step, through stone and shadow. And whatever waited at the end of this path would not just decide where they went next, it would decide who they had become by the time they got there. The ledge began to widen just enough to let the sky return, a thin strip at first, then broader, pale blue fading into the last gold of the day. And with it came a different kind of silence, not the heavy one of the canyon below, but something open, uncertain, as if the land itself was waiting to see what they would do next. Ethan slowed his steps, not from exhaustion, but from awareness, the kind that comes when the ground changes beneath you. The boy walked beside him now without needing guidance, his pace steady, his eyes forward, while the girl stayed close to the woman, her hand no longer gripping, just resting there, a quiet connection that had settled into something natural. The woman's gaze moved across the horizon ahead, reading the distance, the shape of the land, the way the light fell across it, and then she stopped, not abruptly, but with purpose. Ethan halted beside her, his eyes following hers. And there it was, the canyon opening into a wide basin, stretching out for what looked like half a mile before rising again into low hills scattered with scrub and stone. No cover worth naming, no easy path to disappear, just open ground that would expose every step they took. The wind moved differently here, freer, carrying sound farther, and behind them, faint but present. The echo of hooves still followed, slower now, but not gone, never gone. The boy stepped closer to the edge, looking out across the basin, then back at Ethan, his voice quiet but clear. "If we go out there, they will see us." And Ethan did not answer right away, because the boy was right, because sometimes the truth did not need to be softened, only understood. The girl looked up at the woman, her voice barely a whisper. "Where do we go?" And for the first time, the woman did not answer. Immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the land. not searching, but remembering, as if the answer was not in front of them, but somewhere behind her, carried through time rather than distance. Ethan shifted his weight, the necklace still in his hand, its presence no longer a question, but a reminder, and he looked at the basin again, then at the ridge beyond it, calculating not just the distance, but the cost, the time it would take, the space it would expose, the way the riders behind would see them long before they reached the other side. And then he did something unexpected. He turned away from the open path, back toward the rock wall, scanning it slowly, deliberately, as if the answer might still be hidden in shadow rather than light. The woman watched him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then something shifted, subtle but real, recognition, not of the path, but of the way he was looking for it. "You do not follow the obvious," she said quietly, and Ethan shook his head once, his voice low. "The obvious gets you seen." The words settled between them, simple, but heavier than they sounded. The boy glanced between them, understanding more than he should, while the girl simply waited, her eyes moving from one face to the other, trusting that the answer would come without needing to ask again. The wind carried another faint echo from behind. Closer now, the riders adjusting again, narrowing, learning, and Ethan felt the time tighten once more. Not pressing, not rushing, just moving forward with quiet certainty. He stepped closer to the rock, his hand brushing against its surface, rough, uneven, but holding something more than stone, something hidden in the way shadows gathered along its edge. And then he saw it, not a path, not yet, but a break in the rock, narrow, angled, leading not across the basin, but above it, a way that did not belong to the ground at all. And as he turned back toward the others, the light catching the edge of his face, there was no doubt left in his expression, only the kind of decision that does not ask for agreement, only trust. The break in the rock did not reveal itself all at once. It waited, hidden in plain sight, until a man chose to look where others would not. Ethan stepped toward it without hesitation, his hand brushing along the edge as if confirming something the land had already told him. The opening angled upward, narrow at first, then widening just enough to allow passage. Not a trail, not something worn by time, but something that existed quietly, unnoticed by those who moved too quickly to see it. He turned back to the others, his voice calm, steady. "We go up." Not a suggestion, not a question, just the next step. The boy nodded immediately, his trust no longer something he questioned, while the girl looked at the woman, waiting for the one answer that mattered most to her. And the woman held her gaze for a moment before giving a small nod, not forced, not reluctant, but chosen. And that choice settled everything that words could not. They moved together toward the narrow ascent, the rock cool beneath their hands, the incline steady but demanding. Ethan climbed first, guiding from above, the boy following with careful determination, the girl slower but sure, and the woman last, her movements quiet, controlled, as if she had already accepted whatever waited at the end of this path. The wind shifted as they climbed, carrying the open air of the basin below, but also something else, distance, the sound of hooves fading, not gone, but no longer certain, no longer close enough to claim them. Halfway up, Ethan paused, looking back. The canyon stretched behind them in shadow and light, the path they had taken no longer visible from below, hidden now by angle and stone, and for the first time since the dust had risen on the horizon, the space between them and what followed had grown wide enough to breathe. He reached down, steadying the girl as she climbed the final stretch, her small hand gripping his wrist with quiet strength, and when she reached the top, she did not let go right away, her eyes searching his face, not for answers, but for something she had already begun to understand. He gave her a small nod, and that was enough. The boy pulled himself up beside them, turning back instinctively, watching the path below, not out of fear, but out of awareness, while the woman reached the top last, her feet finding the solid ground without hesitation, and when she stood beside Ethan, she did not look back at the canyon. She looked forward, toward the ridge beyond, toward whatever waited there. The light had softened now, the sun slipping lower, casting long shadows across the land, and the basin below lay quiet, empty, offering nothing to those who searched from the wrong place. Ethan exhaled slowly, the necklace still in his hand, its weight no longer unfamiliar. He looked at it once, then down at the girl, and without speaking, he placed it gently back into her small palm, her fingers closing around it instinctively, as if it had always belonged there. She looked up at him, her voice soft, almost lost in the wind. "Why did you help us?" And Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze drifting out across the open land, the ridge ahead, the path they had yet to walk. And after a moment, he spoke, not looking at her, not needing to, because someone once chose not to leave me. The words settled into the quiet space between them, simple, without weight, and yet carrying everything. The woman watched him then, not with suspicion, not with distance, but with something deeper, something that did not need to be named. And as the four of them stood there, above the canyon, beyond the reach of those who followed, the land stretching out before them into something unknown, Ethan Cole understood that the choice he had made was no longer behind him. It was walking with him, step by step, into whatever came next. And out here, that was the only kind of justice that ever lasted.